pleasure today of introducing Dr. Jack Richards to you. We are honored to have him join us here today to share his expertise in the field of language teaching. Dr. Richards has been contributing to the field since the late 60s. His first book was published in 1969, and he continues to work every year on new projects. He's currently working on a series of textbooks for Chinese university students. Dr. Richards has a strong Korean connection. His first visit to Korea was, I believe, in the early 70s when he spoke at Yonsei University. And he remarked about how different Korea was in those days. Dr. Richards continues to visit every year to spend time with his Korean in-laws. We were lucky that our conference coincided with his visit this month. Dr. Richards is not only interested in language teaching. Among his other interests are his beautiful home on the coast of New Zealand called Tiramoana, which means the house over the water in Maori, as well as sponsoring young artists. He sponsors a number of scholarships and grants, including travel grants to international music competitions all over the world. I had the honor of joining Dr. Richards and his husband, Won Hyun-moon, for dinner last night. And with his permission, I share one of his stories. Dr. Richards mentioned that because of his Celtic ancestry, his darker complexion means he's sometimes taken for a local in places like Portugal, Iran, or India. He said on a recent trip to India, he was dressed in a jacket that closely resembled those worn by the hotel staff. Maybe you can guess what happened. It was not surprising when an elderly American lady asked him to take her bags up to her room. "My pleasure," Dr. Richards replied, and he reports she was a very generous tipper. For more information about Dr. Richards' academic work and his arts patronage, and even a video of his beautiful home, you can check out his website at professorjackrichards.com. Now, to talk to us about the 7 myths in language teaching, here is Jack Richards.
Thank you very much. Time is short, so I've got quite a lot of myths to deconstruct. So, language teaching, as I mentioned in the abstract, has been a melting pot for a variety of assumptions and beliefs about what language is, how it can best be learned and taught. And some of these assumptions are based on folklore. Others reflect discarded theories and viewpoints about language teaching and learning. And while some of the ideas we encounter are relatively harmless, others can have a negative impact on approaches both to teaching and to teacher development. And it's these latter kinds of assumptions that I want to address today. I think we go this way. I'm going to go through, if time will permit, these 7 assumptions and look at what are the beliefs and fallacies behind them. I want to start with the first one. Anyone who can speak English can teach English. For many people outside the language teaching profession, and also for some practitioners within it, it's commonly assumed that if you can speak English, then you can teach it. The internet is full of advertisements for native speakers who are needed to teach English in Korea, in China, and other countries. The only qualification needed is to be a native speaker of English, whatever that is, and presumably to be white-skinned as well. So one advertisement proclaims, have you heard that you can go and live in South Korea and get paid to do so? The main requirement is that you have to be born, that's right. If you're from a native English-speaking country, you can get paid to live in the country for a year, teaching children how to speak the language of your birth. Another internet advertisement reads, you don't need prior teaching experience to teach kids in China. You just need to be willing to learn, and we'll help with the rest. So if you apply now for a position at one of our kids and teen schools outside of Shanghai, we'll even pay for your flights to China. So all you need, apparently, is to learn how to create classroom experiences that are fun and engaging. You can pick up techniques you need to master from a short course. Who cares what students are learning? No need for the teacher to know anything about language, the subject matter. It's all about motivation and feeling good and keeping students engaged and occupied, making sure they'll come back for another course next semester. Teacher trainers, too, don't need to know very much. No need to bother with knowledge about language drawn from disciplines as linguistics or second language acquisition, or indeed even from teaching methodology. One teacher training centre in the UK proudly proclaims on its website, "Our teacher trainers draw on their experience in fields such as business training, cinema and video, as well as counselling and exercise choreography," whatever that might be. In fact, the advertisement for the Institute proudly proclaims its disdain for the field of TESOL. It says, "Prospective trainers will not," the course director boasts, "come into contact with a woolly-headed applied linguist, the researcher who cannot teach, or the person whose self-esteem depends on his or her place in a university pecking order." One gets the sense here of a failed academic or a self-proclaimed language teaching guru who dismisses anyone with better qualifications than he has, and who seeks to make novices know that they don't need to bother learning much more than the tricks of the trade. I once visited a language institute here in Korea. The director, a native speaker American with no qualifications in TESOL, showed me some booklets on grammar that he'd prepared for his equally unqualified teachers. They were full of complete nonsense that the man had pulled out of the air to try to explain such things as differences in tenses and articles, although he'd never bothered to consult any of the literature on the role and meaning of tenses and articles in English. So I ask, would you put yourself into the hands of a dentist or a doctor who had no qualifications in dentistry or medicine, or of an airline pilot who wasn't knowledgeable about the plane he or she was flying, or a teacher of mathematics or history of any other subject who had never studied the subject they were teaching? I don't think so. And the same should be true of language teaching. A degree in engineering or literature is no basis for a career in language teaching, nor would it be the basis for a career in teaching geography or history. Nor is the ability to speak English a sufficient qualification to teach English. Although for some so-called English teachers, having English as a mother tongue is a passport to travel to an exotic destination, the field of language teaching has moved on. Today, language teaching is a well-developed profession, which means that it's a career in a field of educational specialization, supported by years of research, theory, and practice. Like other disciplines, it requires a specialized knowledge base obtained through both academic study and practical experience, and it's a field where membership is based on entrance requirements, qualifications, and standards. Sorry, I missed that slide. It's a well-developed profession, a field where membership is based on entry requirements, and this specialized knowledge base includes knowledge about English, knowledge about second language learning, knowledge about learners, knowledge about language teaching pedagogy, principles of pedagogy and practice derived from the many years of theory, research, and practice that has been articulated by expert teachers, teacher educators, and researchers, as well as knowledge about curriculum, materials, and assessment. So there's more to becoming an English teacher than the ability to speak English, the ability to be enthusiastic and to have a bag of techniques. It requires a sound foundation of disciplinary knowledge, including knowledge of the nature of the English language, as well as extensive pedagogical knowledge and experience. The next myth I want to address is this one: an advanced near-native speaker level of proficiency is essential if you want to teach English. If this were true, of course, many of the world's successful English teachers would be out of a job. The truth is, it's not how much English you know or how well you can speak English that determines how well you can teach English, despite the fact that for many so-called English teachers worldwide, as we saw in the advertisement cited earlier, their only qualification is a passport from an English-speaking country. Sadly, there is no direct connection between knowing English or how well you speak English and how well you can teach it. Native speakers, nor fluent English speakers, do not possess a special gene that enables them to implicitly understand the nature of language teaching. What's important is how well the teacher can use his or her knowledge of English and his or her ability in English as a basis for teaching through English. This involves the use of a specialized kind of discourse and a kind of ESP which can be used to support teaching and learning at a level appropriate to the proficiency level of the learners. For many advanced speakers of English, including those who would be described as native speakers, this involves using an appropriate form of teacher talk, learning to use a modified variety of English that serves as a vehicle for teaching English in the classroom. This requires the teacher to be able to modify and manage his or her language use in order to provide suitable learning input, to avoid unnecessary colloquialisms and idiomatic usage, to provide a register of spoken English appropriate for students learning English as an international language, and to provide language input at an appropriate level for learners. The Australian applied linguist Cathy Elder comments on the special nature of teacher discourse required of language teachers, and her research suggests that there are 4 aspects of language and language-related ability that determine a language teacher's ability to teach a language effectively. The ability to draw learners' attention to features of the formal language, the ability to modify target language input to render it comprehensible to learners, the ability to produce well-formed input for learners, and the ability to draw learners' attention to formal features of the language. Elder's research and the work of Donald Freeman and others suggests that the ability to teach English through English, while partly drawing on a person's general communicative ability in English, also requires knowledge of a specific genre of English, together with the discourse skills used in the mode of instruction. The ELT profession is often assumed that native speakers of English are automatically endowed with the ability to use English in this way, the bias of what is sometimes called native speakerism, while non-native speaker teachers will be able to do so if they improve their mastery of English. However, the ability to use English in a way that supports the learning of English has to be mastered by all teachers, whether their mother tongue is English or not. Native speakers of English often find they have to work hard to be able to use English effectively in this way. And when I was initially trained, we were taught to use a vocabulary of 1,000 words, a limited vocabulary, as the basis for instructional discourse, to ensure that our use of vocabulary and other linguistic items was not overmarked by idioms, colloquialisms, and low-frequency vocabulary and grammatical items. For some teachers, the discourse skills needed to teach through English may or may not be acquired on the job, so to speak. For others, they can be the focus of explicit instruction. Of course, there is a threshold of proficiency in English needed to be able to teach English through English, but it's not how much English you know, but how well you can use your English to create effective conditions for teaching and learning. And this can often be achieved with quite restricted mastery of English. The third myth, most of what you need to know about teaching can be learned on the job. One of the difficulties in talking about the teaching English arises from the fact that it's a field where English is both the target as well as the means of teaching. So when we talk about English as a target, we're talking about English as a language, which, like any language, is a complex communicative system that consists of many different dimensions, such as phonetic, phonological, lexical, morphological, semantic, syntactic, pragmatic, discoursal, sociocultural, and so on. Learning about these dimensions of English is a key part of the professional development of teachers. I say more about this a little bit later. None of this knowledge can be picked up on the job, any more than a teacher of history or mathematics can pick up all he or she needs to know on the job through the process of teaching. When we talk about English, however, as the means of teaching, we are talking about the use of English to carry out essential processes and activities that teachers make use of to manage and shape their lessons. This means acquiring a repertoire of techniques and strategies to do the sort of things that you see on the screen there. Now, most of these skills are common to the teaching of any subject, And once they have been introduced in practice during a practicum or other training experience, they are further developed through the experience of teaching. And it's techniques of this kind that are often the focus of short practical courses and workshops at certificate level, and that are the money makers for organizations sending so-called native speakers abroad, as we saw in those advertisements that I cited earlier. Mastery of a set of skills of this kind, as well as a repertoire of techniques and tricks, while important, is an aspect of teaching as performance. Experiencing teaching in a variety of different situations with different kinds of learners and teaching different kinds of content is how a repertoire of basic teaching skills is acquired over time. Over time, experience leads to the development of routines that enable these kinds of skills to be performed fluently, automatically, and with less conscious thought and attention, enabling the teacher to focus on other dimensions of the lesson. But performance that is not supported by knowledge is inevitably superficial, where the activities themselves define the curriculum rather than an understanding of what needs to be learned and how it is acquired. Wiggins and McTighe, in their book on backward design, put it this way. They say the era of activity-oriented design might be called hands-on without being minds-on. Engaging experiences that lead only accidentally, if at all, to insight or achievement. Activity-oriented curricula lack an explicit focus on important ideas and evidence of learning. Learners are led to think that learning is the activity instead of seeing that the learning comes from being asked to consider the meaning of the activity. So with the training and experience, a teacher may be able to present a lesson from a textbook effortlessly and efficiently, but unless he or she is engaged in a deeper level with a lesson, the lesson is simply an act of performance. So what is this deeper level of engagement? Teaching involves processes of critical reflection, understanding, and decision-making. It reflects principles that the teacher uses to guide his or her planning and teaching. It involves the teacher in sophisticated processes of observation, reflection and assessment, and making online decisions about which course of action to take from a range of alternatives that are available. These interactive decisions often prompt teachers to change course during a lesson based on critical incidents and other unanticipated aspects of the lesson. So teaching is more than just a technical process in which teachers present lessons that have been prepared by others from a textbook, lesson plan, or elsewhere. Teaching is a dynamic and interactive process that draws on teachers' understandings, values, principles, and beliefs, and which emerges and develops in often unpredictable ways during the process of teaching. So teachers create lessons from the ground up, so to speak, which is what the Canadian educator Aoki calls the lived curriculum, and what others refer to as the ecological perspective on teaching. As teachers accumulate experience and knowledge, there's a move towards a degree of flexibility in teaching and the development of what is sometimes called improvisational teaching. The research reviewed by Simon Borg and others hence describes some of the following characteristics of expert teachers, which I'll leave you to look at there on the screen. So these dimensions of teaching take us far beyond the level of teaching techniques and into the domain of teacher cognition and teacher thinking. So that while learning to teach from the perspective of skill development can be thought of as the mastery of specific teaching competencies, each of these so-called skills makes use of knowledge and beliefs that draw on a complex knowledge base. And this knowledge base is derived from the teacher's professional education, combined with his or her ongoing engagement and understanding of the processes of teaching. What I'm saying here is, yes, a novice teacher does need to master a core set of skills and competencies that define the core of his or her practical knowledge, but these cannot be separated from the knowledge base that is needed to know when to use them, what they mean, and how they contribute to teaching and learning. You might detect a certain bias here as a textbook writer talking about textbooks. The role of textbooks and how teachers make use of them and their potential impact on teachers and learners, of course, has often aroused discussion and debate in language teaching. And in some institutions, if a teacher is admitted to teaching from a commercial textbook, he or she would be regarded as someone who isn't seriously committed to teaching. Indeed, in some private institutions in countries like Australia, teachers are discouraged from using commercial textbooks, since textbooks are viewed as an easy resort for an ill-prepared teacher. And some years ago, a prominent applied linguist in the UK argued, and I quote here, that teachers should use no materials, published or unpublished, actually conceived or designed as materials for language teaching. Can you imagine that? It's an intriguing and arrogant dismissal of the efforts and resources that go into the development and design of textbooks and related materials, into developing a syllabus that reflects the communicative needs identified in the CEFR or similar scales, or the development and trialing of materials to make sure that they work and are liked and found to be effective by teachers and learners, and of the developments of tests, videos, and other supplementary materials. Of course, such a claim today would be laughed at by teachers in most public education systems, where class size is large, where there's a prescribed curriculum and tests, where teachers have heavy teaching loads and they're often not well paid. Yet more recent version of the anti-textbook approach has been made, for example, by my compatriot and friend Scott Thornbury, advocating what he called a dogma approach to teaching, a term taken from the film industry, referring to filming without scripts or rehearsal. It's based on the idea that instead of basing teaching on a pre-planned syllabus, a set of objectives and published materials, teaching is built around conversational interaction between teacher and students and among students themselves. Quote, teaching should be done using only the resources that the teachers and students bring to the classroom themselves and what happens to be in the classroom. I don't know how many lessons one can build around talking about a whiteboard, but apparently it is possible. So the syllabus or language focus is not pre-planned, and language and content emerge from the processes of interaction and negotiation that the teacher initiates. It focuses on emergent language. Teaching is not a question of imposing external language syllabus, they say, but of nurturing the students' inbuilt language learning mechanisms and language acquisition agenda. It's an idealized view. It perhaps would be okay in a one-to-one situation, but completely impractical, of course, in a more structured educational system where there's a syllabus and tests and so on. So from this viewpoint, however, use of a textbook is seen to be an obstacle to real interaction and communication taking place in the classroom. But is there any evidence of this? Certainly not in many classes I often observe, where teachers use materials creatively, adapting and adding them to suit their students' needs, as well as using them to prepare students to access other opportunities for learning through media or on the internet. Perhaps critics of textbooks are reacting to lessons of this kind that reported by one researcher observing classes in Indonesia. But the answer here is not to expect the teachers to throw away the textbook unless it was really worthless, but instead to offer the teacher an opportunity for professional development, perhaps a focus on creative and engaging ways of using the textbook. Another common criticism of commercial materials has to do with the authenticity of textbook language, then the representation of content that they provide. As far as textbook language is concerned, it's true that textbook writers generally employ their own intuitions about language use as the basis for writing dialogues, inventing scripts for listening texts, and creating reading passages, for example, though increasingly information from corpus research is also made use of. The result has sometimes been the charge that textbooks contain unnatural or artificial language. This, of course, depends on the skill of the textbook writer in developing input texts that reflect features of authentic language use, something that may not always be achieved. So the textbook writer's goal should be to use texts and discourse samples that show how language is really used, and that also enables learners to use authentic communicative processes when carrying out the activities. A dialogue in a textbook, or one prepared by the teacher, may have been written by the textbook author or teacher, but may have been constructed to reflect features of authentic conversational interaction, things like turn-taking, back-channeling, echo responses, and so on. In many cases, it's these features, rather than the text itself, that form the focus of classroom activities. However, it's also the case that today's learners often rely less on their textbook as a source of authentic language use and make greater use of the media and the internet for examples of how people use English outside of classroom contexts, even if some of these sources, such as movies and television, are in themselves scripted. I often ask successful young speakers of English what sources they use in targeting the accent and idiomatic expressions they wish to acquire, and the answer is inevitably the same: movies and television. No one has ever suggested they got them from one of my textbooks. Another criticism of international textbooks relates to the content and values that these books often reflect, and critics, like John Gray, for example, have observed that British and American English textbooks typically contain characters who reflect a middle-class lifestyle with an emphasis on travel and consumption, and avoid real issues that many students have to face in their own lives. Nevertheless, writers for major publishers seek to ensure that their textbook do reflect progressive and politically acceptable values within their own culture and the cultures of the teacher who will be selecting their textbooks. Efforts are made to avoid social bias and ethnocentrism and to reflect universal concerns, needs, and values. However, in order to make textbooks acceptable in many different contexts, controversial topics may be avoided, leading to the somewhat bland and familiar topics that occur in textbooks. The issue then is not whether to use textbooks or not, since the need and role of textbooks will depend on the local context. In some situations, textbooks may not be necessary, since the institution provides the means for teachers to develop their own context-specific teaching materials and resources. In situations where textbooks are used, however, they should be seen as source books rather than course books. In other words, they serve as a springboard for teachers to build on and extend, rather than something that controls and directs the way the teacher teaches. The next myth: standard British or American spoken English is the best target for learners. Well, certainly as in New Zealand, I wouldn't be agreeable to that, would I? Teachers and learners of English are sometimes confused about what the learning target should be. Should it be British, American, or some other native speaker variety of English? Or what standard should teachers have in mind when planning and assessing the learners as well as their own English? This question would have been answered very differently 30 years ago. In the past, in talking about English and speakers of English, the world was divided into three kinds of places. One was territories where English was the mother tongue or first language of the majority of the population, like the US and the UK and Australia. Another was places, mainly formerly countries that had been under British administration in colonial times, places where it was called a second language, in other words, widely used within a country for education, government, media, and so on, alongside a range of local languages. These were normally multicultural communities such as Singapore, India, Nigeria, and so on, and where local varieties of spoken English have become established. The third context, places like Korea, France, Russia, China, where English had limited societal functions and was mainly a subject in the school curriculum. With this view of the different roles of English in different contexts, spoken English, as it was used in places where English was a first language, usually the US or Great Britain, was usually considered the target for learners in countries like Korea, Russia, or China, where English had the status of a foreign language. In other settings, like the Philippines and so on, standard local varieties of spoken English were accepted as the target. And however, at that time, there was reluctance by some scholars to accept the legitimacy of local varieties of English. Clifford Prater, head of the ESL program at UCLA in the 60s, once wrote an article called The British Heresy in TESOL, which argued against the acceptance of local Englishes and tried to uphold the superiority of native speaker Englishes. While Prater's idea themselves would now be considered heresy, it does raise the issue of the usefulness of the term native speaker. For example, some 40% of Singaporeans use English at home and raise their children in English, often using other languages as well when needed, and as do many people in India and other multilingual countries that were formerly under British administration in the colonial period. By comparison, in English-speaking countries, many so-called native speakers have a very limited understanding of the use of English, functioning in a very restricted set of domains and operating within a very restricted vocabulary, a much more limited knowledge of English than many people for whom English is a so-called foreign language. There are far more expert users of English in India than there are in the United Kingdom. So many native speakers similarly have a very limited reading and writing abilities in English, their so-called mother tongue. And when we talk about teaching English, what do we mean by English? What English are we talking about, and what kind of English? There is no such thing as English, really. There are only Englishes. The concept of English is really an abstraction. It refers to a whole range of speech varieties and speech styles used differently by people in many parts of the world. Different ways of using English reflect the different identities people express through the use of English. Identity may be shaped by many factors, including personal biography, nationality, culture, working conditions, age, and gender. Additionally, when we talk about the status of English worldwide, we need to distinguish between written English and spoken English. In a sense, English is just like Chinese. There's a written form that varies little from context to context, but there's a large variety of different spoken varieties of English. So in most cases, when presented with a text in written English, it would not be clear what part of the world the writer lived in or what variety of English he or she speaks. Targets for written English are virtually the same wherever the learner or user of English is, apart from minor differences in spelling and vocabulary. However, different varieties of spoken English exist because the way we speak a language serves to mark aspects of our identity, and this may include markers of age, gender, ethnicity, class, nationality, sexual orientation, region, and so on. Standard varieties of a language are not intrinsically superior to other varieties. They simply carry greater prestige because they may be the variety spoken in the capital or the variety used in the spoken media or by the elite. So whether a learner chooses as his or her goal in learning spoken English a prestige variety used in an English-speaking country, which could be the US, Canada, or the UK, is entirely a matter of personal choice. I guess the entertainment industry is behind the preference for an American accent by many younger people today, but not for everyone. For many people, the choice of British or a North American variety of spoken English is irrelevant for them, and they may wish to mark their own identity as Koreans, for example, through the way they speak English, using, for example, English as spoken by fluent users of English in their own country as a model, without necessarily referencing how English is spoken in so-called English-speaking countries. So, a little summary there. The sixth one, linguistics and applied linguistics are not of much practical use to language teachers. That was the sort of assumption behind that course director from one of those language schools in Kent that I cited earlier on, getting a little bit closer to identifying who that person was. Before looking at this myth, I'd remind you again of the distinction I referred to between targets for teaching and learning and means of teaching and learning. I noted above that in TESOL, the target of teaching and learning is mastery of the English language. Presumably, the better one understands as a teacher the nature of the English language, including its systems of phonology, syntax, and grammar, and how it works at the level of discourse and text, the better informed one will be when it comes to teaching English. This involves acquiring relevant disciplinary knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, the knowledge that an educated English teaching professional should know about his or her subject matter, which is English. So disciplinary knowledge refers to what teachers need to know about the subject that they teach, and constitutes knowledge which would not be shared with teachers of other subject areas. Disciplinary knowledge, in this case knowledge about English and the teaching and learning of English, refers to a circumscribed body of knowledge that is considered by the language teaching profession to be essential to becoming a fully qualified language teacher. Such knowledge is acquired by special study and is not picked up on the job. Possessing knowledge of this kind leads to professional recognition and status. It's important to stress that disciplinary knowledge is part of professional education and is drawn from the field of linguistics and its related domains of study such as sociolinguistics, discourse analysis, world English, and so on, as well as from applied linguistics and language pedagogy. Of course, not every branch and sub-branch of linguistics or applied linguistics contributes to the core disciplinary knowledge of linguistics, of TESOL, since some aspects of linguistics, such as forensic linguistics or anthropological linguistics, feed into other disciplines rather than into language teaching. Possessing knowledge about English and the nature of language learning and teaching supports a deeper understanding of the enterprise the teacher is engaged in, as well as it provides a basis for important decision-making. It should help the teacher understand why learners make consistent errors of pronunciation, make informed decisions about targets, understand the difference between spoken and written, and so on. Here's an example from a teacher's narrative of a Hong Kong teacher who lacks adequate disciplinary knowledge, in this case knowledge of grammar. She reports in her diary that you can read there. So this is a teacher who lacks relevant disciplinary knowledge, lacks relevant knowledge about the subject that she is teaching. Here's a rather amusing example of lack of disciplinary knowledge causing what is called identity stress, prompted by a teacher's ignorance of some simple facts about English. And it occurred in a class I observed of a student teacher, native speaker, Australian, teaching a group of international students in Sydney. One of the students asked, "What does several mean?" Several. And the teacher stumbled for a few seconds and then he said, "Oh, it means 7. When questioned later by the supervisor as to why he gave this answer, he said, "Oh, I couldn't think of an answer. I didn't want the students to think I was stupid, so I just said the first things that came into my head." The following narrative describes a teacher reflecting back on a course she had taken on grammar. There's several slides here, so I'll just let you look at that one. So disciplinary knowledge in language teaching includes knowledge both about language as well as knowledge and skills drawing on the applied linguistic domains of language teaching pedagogy, curriculum, and materials design and assessment. With this kind of knowledge, teachers are better prepared to make judgments of these kinds, to make decisions of these kinds. So perhaps I could summarize the point I'm making here simply by saying, to be a professional English teacher, you have to know stuff. The last point I want to make is the assumption that grammar is not a priority anymore, and particularly since communicative language teaching has become more widespread. So one of the myths has been that grammar is no longer important, But what in fact has changed is our understanding of the nature of grammar and its contribution to communicative language use. A shift in understanding from dealing with grammar as knowledge to focus on grammar as ability. Grammar as knowledge focuses on knowledge of the rules that account for grammatically correct language, and its unit of focus is the sentence. In traditional approaches to language teaching, it's typically viewed as an independent component of language ability and assessed through discrete point tests that assessed mastery of different grammatical items, and correct language use was achieved through a drill and practice methodology, controlled speaking and writing exercises that sought to minimize opportunities for errors. A methodology with these kinds of features. Grammar as knowledge. Grammar as ability, however, refers to the ability to use grammar as a communicative resource in spoken and written communication, requires a different pedagogical approach. Its unit of focus is the text, not the sentence. And the assumption is, as you see there, that the choices that speakers or writers make are not made in a vacuum, but in a context of language use. They are thus text-based, not sentence-level choices made in the act of participating in a communicative event. So in order to develop grammar as a communicative resource, it needs to be taught and assessed as a component of communicative ability and performance, particularly in relation to the productive skills of writing and speaking. And my colleague Randy Reppin and I have elaborated this in a paper which is on my website, published in the RLC Journal. You can find that in the section on my website on publications, in which we look at 12 approaches to the teaching of grammar that reflect approaching grammar through texts. So rather than thinking of grammar as the rules for correct sentence formation and practice, the rethinking of our understanding of grammar focuses on grammar as a multi-dimensional aspect of language knowledge and ability. And the teaching of grammar seeks to develop learners' awareness of the nature of texts and the functions of grammar within them, and to expand the grammatical resources that learners make use of when they engage in the production of spoken and written texts. As you can see, I'm looking at my time, and I did manage to more or less stick to my lesson plan, but it was a bit of a rush. So these are 7 that I pulled out for discussion today. There could have been others, other misconceptions that we come across quite regularly. For example, you should never use the mother tongue in the classroom, or that translation should play no role in language teaching, or that if children learn 2 languages at the same time, they will get them all mixed up. Some myths come and go. Some are relatively harmless. Others are more persistent and are not helpful when important decisions need to be made in language teaching. So hopefully this presentation has piqued your curiosity and may help lay some myths to rest, enabling us to focus on issues that really matter. Thank you.